yeah, so this sort of general problem of the individual, yeah, it takes on these different forms throughout history, like we saw um, in the opposition between Plato and Aristotle. He talks about this problem of the integration of the individual in the whole, and the different answers that Plato and Aristotle give to that problem, uh, and then and that's sort of like a component of the bigger problem of reconciling the order of simultaneity and the order of succession, or being and becoming, and so I think all of these oppositions or all of these different problems are all supposed to fit together to sort of form a general problem of the individual that he's trying to solve.
Yeah, that makes sense. One other thing that stuck out to me was the discussion of, in the introduction, when he says that the pre-individual is not can't be described or can't be understood in terms of principle of identity or principle of non-contradiction. I guess one place we've seen that so far is in the discussion of the Eastern and Western heresies in early Christianity. That was kind of an interesting parallel.
Yeah, that's I think like a lot of the sort of the groups that ended up becoming heretical, like of course it was a sort of a process, like it wasn't the distinction between orthodoxy and heresy is a sort of result of this complicated conflict between the different parties. But what a lot of the different heresies share is a sort of insistence on the principle of non-contradiction, and this kind of holding on to, like, trying to eliminate contradictions by holding on to one side of this opposition, like Christ is either fully human or fully divine. He has to be one or the other. He can't be both at the same time. And so these are various attempts to eliminate contradictions and make Christianity into a consistent doctrine, whereas the Orthodox theory or the Orthodox doctrine sort of holds on to these contradictions, and keeps them, like, keeps both sides of the contradiction in effect at the same time, and so that it's a more difficult intellectual position to occupy or to hold on to. But yeah, so that's sort of how the principle of non-contradiction plays out in relation to the heresies.
Right.
Okay, well, maybe we can get started. I think maybe we'll do a little bit shorter today. We'll see how long it goes, but I think I want to stop at the beginning of the early modern section, and then we'll pick up the early moderns next time, just for the sake of finding a good stopping point. The section on Descartes is pretty long, so maybe we can stop just before that. Okay, so let me get the bot going, and we'll start. Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing on Individuation, Volume 2, the text History of the Notion of the Individual. We're still in the medieval era. So last time we looked at the 13th century, and some of the different positions that came up in the 13th century. I think, well, I mean, this era is an era that I know very little about, and almost entirely secondhand. So I don't have a lot of sort of commentary to make on this. But I think what we saw last time was this opposition between Saint Thomas Aquinas, and his notion of the individuation of the intellect, or this sort of non-individuation of the intellect. The intellect, the intellect is a pure form, and so it's not individuated because the individuation of entities has to do with the matter that fills the form. So, like, a particular horse is the form of the horse as such, plus the matter that makes it, X centimeters tall, and this exact color, and so on. And so it's these accidental qualities that particularize the form and make it into an actual individual. whereas the intellect is because it's this pure form, it doesn't have these accidents that make it into an individual, and so he also a sort of consequence of this is that because angels are pure forms, they are individuated or distinguished from each other in the same way that species are from each other, as opposed to as individuals. So each angel is a species of one, um, and so this is a sort of well-known doctrine of Aquinas, and this notion of the intellect as sort of non-individuated is one that caused a lot of controversy because it comes into conflict with the Christian doctrine of the personal survival of the soul or the personal immortality. So if the intellect is the only aspect of the soul that is sort of that or if the intellect is what is sort of most immediately immortal or that survives death, as Aquinas also holds, then and the intellect is also what is non-individual within the soul, then it starts to become hard to understand how the soul as a personal entity, as my soul, and not just the intellect as such, survives death and then can be subject to judgment after death and so on. And so there were some church officials who, and the Inquisition in particular, condemned certain doctrines of Averroes and the Averroist school. And it's not clear to what extent this is actually directed at Averroes as such, but it was Averroes was sort of taken as the symbol of like atheism or of a doctrine that would deny the immortality of the soul. And then we also saw, following this, we saw Duns Scotus, who has a different doctrine of individuation compared to Aquinas. In particular, he holds that there's what he calls the quiddity or the haexiety of an entity. So Socrates has a particular essence, or Socrateity, or what makes him Socrates, or this horse has the particularity that makes it this horse. There's a thisness to every entity, and this is something that that is something distinct from the species. So there's the horse as such that the horse belongs to, and then there's thisness of this horse here, and then also what goes along with this is a primacy of the will in the sphere of ethics, as opposed to an idea of the intellect or the understanding as being primary in more traditional ethical theories. So it's not that we have a knowledge of the good and then act in accordance with that knowledge. Instead, it's the will that is primary, in both in the human individual and in God. So it's God's divine will that brings about the creation of the world, and all of the sort of structure of the world follows from this divine will. Oh yes, and so Angus has posted a important question or comment here about this notion of haexiety that Scotus introduces is also distinct from the idea of a material accident. So it's not just so like in Aquinas' theory we have the form, which is sort of filled out by the matter that individualizes that form. Whereas here in Scotus's theory, we have an account where this quiddity or haexiety is a sort of individualization, or this sort of immediate individualization of the entity. It's not just a combination of form and matter that sort of individualizes the form. There's an individual essence of the entity or an individual nature of the entity. So yes, it's a different doctrine than Aquinas' doctrine. Okay, so that's what we saw last time. Let's pick up from the beginning of the 14th century. Yeah, Angus, if you want to go ahead and read.
The 14th century. However, this primacy of the will leads to a consequence in opposition to the starting point. This consequence is developed particularly by Thomas Bradwardine. There is no causality other than divine causality. There is no, quote, necessary reason or law in God prior to his will, unquote. And, quote, the divine will is the efficient cause of everything, whatever it may be, the driving cause of all movement. The consequence of this manner of envisioning is that the freest act that man can undertake is necessitated by God. Quote, man is God's serf, a spontaneous and unconstrained serf. This theory of the unfree will is represented in the 14th century by John of Mirecourt, who teaches at the University of Paris. Even when it does not end up explicitly denying the fact that human freedom supposes free will, this theological determinism nevertheless leads to making it considered as, quote, the lowest degree of freedom, unquote, according to the expression Descartes will use. We should note that from this point on, theological determinism constitutes a doctrine that can be opposed for long periods of time to the doctrine that makes freedom consist in individual free will. Individual free will indeed makes choice possible, and choice can be made between pre-existing and determined terms. Conversely, the freedom of an individual submitted to an unfree will is the fact of continuing to act in the path in which it is determined to act or stop. Stopping is not a choice, no more so than action. It therefore seems paradoxical that man is most profoundly creative not in choice, supposing free will, but in action, through which he acts according to God and in the condition of unfree will. There is a possible transition from theological determinism to determinism through character and destiny. It is therefore possible to grasp in Duns Scotus a manner of conceiving the individual that will lead not just to the conception of John Wycliffe and then of Luther, but also to that of Descartes and perhaps to certain aspects of the thought of Rousseau and Maine de Dijon. Nevertheless, for a new conception of the individual to become possible, there would need to be a reform of all metaphysics, particularly in the case of the theory of knowledge. This reform begins with the Dominican Durandus of Saint-Pourçain, who declares sensible and intelligible species to be fictive. The active intellect is also declared to be fictive. The universal only differs from the individual in the way that the undetermined differs from the determined. The universal only arises from a certain manner of considering the sensible image by not taking account of what is individual in it. The problem of individuation consequently becomes a false problem because it supposes that the species exists before the individual. If this anteriority of existence is no longer supposed, if nothing but what is individual exists, it is no longer necessary to ask what individualizes the species. Nominalism therefore leads to a new position of the problem of individuality. That which is individual is the first object of our knowledge. This new attitude is still found in the Franciscan Petrus Aureolus, author of the Commentarium Sententiarum. Quote, it is nobler to know an individual and designated reality than to know it in an abstract and universal way. The soul knows the thing not through a species, which is an intermediary, but through an esse intentionale, or forma specularis, which are knowledge's own object produced in the intellect by things, thereby constituting impressions. These impressions are the thing itself present in the mind based on what is currently visible of the former for the latter. Knowledge of species and knowledge of genus are only due to the differences of clarity and distinction of impression. Genus corresponds to the least degree of perfection. The progress of knowledge goes from the universal to the singular, which means from the confused to the clear and distinct. For knowledge, the individual is the principle of perfection. However, it could be supposed that the hierarchy of the degrees of being follows the hierarchy of degrees of perfection. So this seems like another iteration of nominalism, where the clearer the impression of kind of an object of knowledge, the more individual that object will be. So it's sort of like a blurrier impression is what would give knowledge of the genus or the species as opposed to the individual.
Yeah, this is a sort of further development of the Aristotelian doctrine of knowledge of universals. For Aristotle, of course, the individual substance is the primary reality, and then universals are the result of some sort of comparison of individual substances. And so we learn the universal horse by comparing different horses and extracting what is common to all of them. And so this account here is sort of a further development of that version, and it holds that it's not just that we don't have this sort of intellectual process of grasping the essence of the entity, the essence of the horse, like we do in Aristotle. We instead have a sort of almost an automatic process where the impressions sort of get mixed or confused, and it's these confused perceptions or confused impressions that constitute knowledge of the universals, and here we see the progress of knowledge is sort of the opposite order from the way it's presented in Aristotle. So instead of having knowledge of sensible things and then performing an operation of generalization or abstraction and extracting universals from them, we instead have this confused knowledge of universals, and then as our knowledge progresses, we get more and more particularized knowledge, and eventually, or in the ideal case, we end up with knowledge of an individual. So yeah, it's a form of nominalism, but in contrast to the sort of Aristotelian nominalism, or earlier nominalism that still had a role for the intellect as grasping the essence of an entity, and then performing acts of generalization. So here it's a kind of automatic process. And there's also the earlier bit about the nature of the will, and Simondon presents the sort of theory of knowledge stuff as being a consequence, or as being required to make sense of this doctrine of the will. I'm not sure I really grasped the connection between the two, but this doctrine of the will as being unfree, as being the human will is sort of acted by God. So all of our actions are brought about by God, and there's no such thing as a human free will that would be distinct from God's will. And this was and so Simondon points out that this sort of leads towards some of the doctrines of Protestant authors, according to which there's a sort of election of certain individuals. Certain individuals are chosen by God to be saved, and then others are chosen by God to be damned. And our own actions are just a sort of result of God's decision to save or damn us, and there's no such thing as free will that can bring about salvation or damnation for us. So this is obviously a very difficult doctrine to hold. It makes human action in effect just a consequence of God's action, and it makes our action irrelevant from a moral point of view, because it's already decided whether we're going to be saved or damned. And I should also bring up here that Simondon doesn't talk about this, but this notion of God as acting through man, or as the human will, as being a part of the divine will, or a consequence of the divine will. This doctrine has an important, or raises an important problem, which is the problem of evil, which so in this doctrine, the form it would take in this doctrine is that if God is the ultimate agent in all of our actions, if it's ultimately God who is acting through us, then every evil action is brought about by God, and so there's every terrible catastrophe or horrible action that you can think of that throughout history is something that God did, and so it's hard to understand why we shouldn't attribute the evil of these actions to God under this theory, and so you have to come up with some sort of explanation of how either God is not responsible for the evil, or the evil is part of a bigger plan, or something like that. Some sort of explanation of why there is what seems to be evil in the world if everything is brought about by God. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. I can read this. It's a short one. Let's see. Yeah, I'll read the next two sections because they're both short. Okay, William of Ockham. William of Ockham systematizes this doctrine by first showing that if the universal existed in itself, it would be an individual, which is contradictory. The universal cannot explain the singular, for it can only duplicate singular beings and not explain them. To put the universal into singular things, whereby the mind would extract it through abstraction, is to render it individual. These arguments recall those we already find in the critique that Aristotle wields against the separate idea in Plato, but the reasoning itself also reaches Aristotle's doctrine. For William of Ockham, universals are in the significations of a word: intentio animae, conceptus animae, passio animae, will of the soul, conception of the soul, affection of the soul. Universals are signs or significations. They are neither in words nor in things. Universals replace the very things that they designate in the proposition. Universals are therefore defined by their usage in knowledge. The problem of universals is no longer a problem of nature, but a problem of function, of usage. The origin of this doctrine is found in Abelard. It supposes that active relation has the value of being. It is in fact quite different from considering universals as a pure flatus vocis, and from considering them as images that will indifferently represent any of the singular things contained in their extension, and that will be able to replace them, just as the sign replaces the thing signified. Universals are not things, but the relations between signs are veritable relations just as much as the relations between things. One can act with universals as the algebraic mathematician acts with his abstract symbols, supponere pro ipsis rebus, standing for the things themselves. One of the most important consequences of this new theory of knowledge is that the primitive knowledge of singular things, which is veritable knowledge, attains through intuition either sensible things or, quote, certain intelligible things that do not fall under any meaning at all, such as intellections, the act of the will, joy, sadness, and these types of things which man can experience to be in him, unquote. Alongside outer experience, which reveals the sensible to us, inner experience reveals the intelligible to us. This is a whole new domain of reality, i.e. the world internal to the individual, insofar as he is aware of it by way of inner intuition, which is revealed here with its process of knowledge and its qualification. The dignity of individual reality not only consists in the fact that the individual is subject to the internal and external experiences that found the knowledge. This dignity also consists in the fact that the internal reality of the individual becomes an object of knowledge through intuition, whereas the questions of metaphysics are beyond the reach of our reason. In some sense, metaphysics becomes the knowledge of realities internal to the individual. Nicolas of Autrecourt. The critique of Aristotle's physics and metaphysics is pursued in the teaching of Nicolas of Autrecourt through the examination of the notions of causality and substance. The link of causality is no longer the close relative of the link of identity, since causality cannot be conceived as the production of the similar by the similar. Becoming is an unconnected succession of moments. The same critique is applicable to the notion of substance. There is no subject of the appearances given by the senses that can be known intuitively or discursively. The conclusion is important for the doctrine of man qua individual. Quote, I am certain with evidence only of the objects of my senses and of my acts. End quote. The subject is aware of his existence through acts. Cartesian thought is not opposed to this way of contemplating the knowledge of the subject in his isolation, thereby avoiding any question concerning individuation, because the reality of the subject is initially grasped, strictly via the conditions of knowledge, as individualized. No doubt this point of view poses the critical problem, but it is important to realize that this reflection on the knowledge of the subject starts with Siget of Brabant, and that there was already with him a simultaneously logical and ontological aspect characteristic of this set of arguments. Quote, everything that appears to us is merely dream and simulacrum, such that we are not certain of the existence of anything, unquote. This proposition pertains to the impossibilia, whose demonstration can be provided through logical play. It is not the senses themselves which merely give us appearances, but another faculty alone that can judge if these appearances are true. This reasoning has a Cartesian aspect. It is completed by Nicolas of Autrecourt, who goes to the point of attacking the notion of the faculties of the soul, asserting that we do not have the right to conclude from the act of will to the existence of will. This thesis leads to considering the individual subject as a first term that does not require any explication and is the source and foundation of all knowledge and every action. Nevertheless, one principle of Aristotle's philosophy remained to be fought against to guarantee the primacy of the individual as cause. Quote, everything that is moved by something else, unquote. According to this principle, movement, not just in its initial moment, but in each of its successive moments, is produced by the mover that contains in act that which, in the moved, is in the process of being realized.
One thing that I...
sorry.
Go ahead. I was going to say really quick, I was reading that book on the history of the individual in like the early modern period, and in the introduction, the person who compiled the essays said that in the medieval period there was this kind of subordination of epistemology to ontology, because the alternative would be a kind of epistemological, the possibility of a question as to the knowledge of the existence of God. But it seems like there maybe, at least in Nicholas of Autrecourt and maybe some of these other thinkers, there is more of an emphasis on this, like the doubtfulness of I guess starting with the valorization of the will at the expense of the intellect, the kind of skepticism as to the possibility of reasoning our way to knowledge of things, and also as to the accuracy of sense data, that I don't know if that would have been possible in the earlier medieval stuff we were.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's a certain tendency in some history of philosophy to sort of skip over the medieval period and then have Descartes appear as if out of nowhere, as if he just sort of has a clean slate and just comes out of nowhere with his epistemological formulation of philosophy. And we see here, again, this is stuff that I only know secondhand, but we see here that there are medieval thinkers who are already very concerned with epistemology and with the possibility of knowledge of God, with the possibility of knowledge of the empirical reality, and who come up with formulations that are quite similar to Descartes in certain respects. And so especially with Nicolas of Autrecourt, we have this starting with the individual as the beginning of knowledge, the individual subject, and so there's no problem of individuation in the way that there was earlier. There's no question of what is it that makes the individual into an individual, because you start immediately with the individual subject as the sort of presupposition of knowledge, and it's that individual starting point that is the basis of the rest of philosophy. So the whole formulation of the problem of the individual is transformed, as we'll see probably later today when we get to the beginning of the early modern period, that as opposed to sort of trying to figure out what is it that makes an individual into an individual, starting from something that is not an individual and then trying to account for the individuation of that reality. We instead start with the individual subject as the basis for philosophy, and then from that starting point, then we try to get outwards, get to knowledge of the world and knowledge of God. And then we also have going back to William of Ockham. So this is again, his doctrine is it's not quite nominalism, because it's sometimes called conceptualism in history of philosophy texts. So he holds that universals are only in the intellect. So there's no such thing as the form of the horse as such, but instead we when we grasp the horse, or when we think of a horse, our intellect is capable of grasping a certain aspect of the entity of this horse, and sort of grasping it as a horse, so putting it into a certain category. And so it's only in the soul, in the intellect, that there is such a thing as a universal. There's no such thing as a universal as something distinct from the intellect or distinct from the human soul. But this, it's kind of a subtle difference, but it's not quite the same thing as nominalism, according to which universals have only a verbal existence. So there's no such thing as universals. There's only universal names of entities. So in this doctrine, universals are just sort of fictions, whereas in Occam's doctrine, universals are concepts that exist in the soul, or they're categories through which we grasp entities. And so Simondon makes the comment here that this conceptualism sort of transforms the problem of individuation, because now we all of the problems of metaphysics, of the relation between various intellectual concepts, they all become sort of internal to the soul, internal to the intellect, and so it's a question of how these different concepts are related to each other, as opposed to trying to grasp the essence of entities as they are outside the intellect. And so this whole sort of realm of the internal begins to open up, and this, of course, with Descartes is sort of privileged as the realm of philosophy, where we have this strict distinction between physics as the realm of external reality, the science that treats of external reality, of extension, and then philosophy, which treats of the inner realm of the soul. So we see here sort of the prefiguration of that distinction, where metaphysics now is becoming a science of the inner, a science of what is contained in the soul. And then maybe one last point is the last bit in the section on Nicolas Vautrecourt, this bit about motion. We'll see more on this as we proceed today, but one of the sort of key principles that distinguish modern philosophy from medieval philosophy, and philosophy in the broad sense, including science, what became science. One of the sort of key principles is the doctrine of motion, where medieval philosophy as a whole, or in general, sticks to an Aristotelian conception of motion, in which there has to be an agent of motion. There has to be something. So if motion is the transition from potentiality to actuality, there has to be something that is actual that brings about motion. So motion includes change of qualities as well as change of location. So if something is cold and becomes hot, there has to be something hot that brings about that transformation of heating up. And likewise, if an entity is at position A and moves to position B, then there has to be some active entity in motion to bring about that change. Right, yeah. So we have change of quantity, change of quality, and change of place. And then there's generation and destruction, which he sometimes, I think, counts as kinds of motion, and then sometimes not. Yeah. And then, so the medieval philosophy as a whole sticks to this sort of account of motion. And in particular, one of the consequences of this account of motion is that an entity only remains in motion so long as there's something actual that is maintaining that motion. And so one of the problems of this conception was how to account for the movement of projectiles. So like an arrow or a cannonball or whatever. So the action that brings about the motion is the rebound, the string in the bow rebounding after being pulled, for example, in the case of the arrow. But then after the arrow leaves the bow, it continues in motion for a certain amount of time before it eventually hits a target or lands or whatever. And so the problem was to account for how the arrow stays in motion during its flight. And there were various theories of how the air sort of pushes it forward as it flies through the air, and various attempts to come up with an account for the motion of projectiles. And then what happens in the modern era, as we'll see later today, is that there's a transition to an inertia account of motion, so that motion continues until something stops it, until something brings about the end of the motion. And so on this account, we don't need to sort of explain the motion of projectiles in this sort of artificial sense, because we just see the projectile is put in motion and then continues in motion until it hits something, or until something stops its motion. And so there's a completely different conception of motion that comes about in the transition from medieval philosophy to modern philosophy, and we'll see a few different versions of this new conception of motion that start to appear in the late medieval period.
And then the motion at that time, like they only stopped by like external factors, like not the that's the idea that that very first at the beginning of the idea, like when it first like generated, the motion is only controlled by the external factors.
Yes, that's right. So in the modern conception of motion that we see starting, well, Galileo is sort of the culmination of this this account of motion. But in this modern account of motion, an entity continues in motion as long as it doesn't encounter something that stops that motion or changes that motion. Of course, this is an idealization, because in our everyday experience, we have air resistance and friction and so on that cause motion to come to a halt eventually. But the idea is that in a vacuum, you would have continued motion indefinitely. Sort of the internal principle of motion would continue without change forever. It's only something external that can bring about a change in the direction of motion or stop the motion.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Right. So let's go on to the next section. If someone else would like to read, we'll just read the one section, because the next one is a little bit longer.
Is that John Britton?
Yes.
Jean Britton?
Yeah. Would you like to read that one for us?
Okay. Jean Britton or Jean Buridan? Which one? Jean Britton?
Jean Buridan.
Jean Buridan, okay. With Buridan, this principle, with all the metaphysical consequences it entails, is replaced by the first formulation of the principle of inertia. Movement is not perpetually sustained and maintained by a celestial intelligence. Movement is due to an impetus that is communicated by the mover to the thing moved. This impetus is a certain power, or, in the vocabulary of modern physics, a certain kinetic energy that makes the mobile capable of continuing to move by itself in the same direction. This impetus is all the more important as the speed with which the mover is moved increases. The movement would go on indefinitely if it were not impeded by the resistance of air and gravity. If these circumstances did not exist, this impediment would not occur, and movement would go on indefinitely. This is the case for the movement of celestial bodies, which consequently leads to the uselessness of the moving intelligences in any special essence by God. For Bourdain, the movement of the heaven can be assimilated to the movement of projectiles, which, with the principle of inertia, establishes the unity of mechanics and replaces the theory of natural places, including its corollaries, i.e., the finiteness of the world and geocentrism. A study like the one Albert Saxony conducts on falling bodies, along with hypotheses like the one he formulates relative to the immobility of the heavens and to the earth movement, following the footsteps of the author of the Timaeus, John Scott's Heresies and L. Albertus Magnus. shows that the new spirit brings about in the sciences a veritable decentering of the subject of vital appearances and vulgar knowledge. The reflective individual will no longer be the center of the world, privileged in his dignity, but due to this decentering, he will get to become the author of an objective knowledge he will construct. The paradoxical aspect of notion of the individual is also revealed on this point. The individual loses his geocentric and anthropocentric dignity, but he becomes the being who depends only on himself. The twofold situation of man and the world noted by Pascal is already beginning to blossom in this 14th century critique of Aristotelian physics. The study of the individual's participation in a superior reality holds moments when the human individual becomes aware of his self-creative power, particularly in the sciences. Undoubtedly, certain errors persist that reduce the fruitfulness of the principles of the new physics. For example, in Buridan and Albert of Saxony, the principle of inertia is not accompanied by the principle according to which everybody with a certain speed yet exempt from the action of any force continues its movement indefinitely in a straight line at the same speed. These two authors thought that if a body began to undergo the beginning of circular movement, it would continue the circular movement when the forces are stopped. Yet, the mode of new knowledge with its main hypothesis was defined, and its paradigmatic role began to become more widespread. These new methods are even more clearly evident in Nicole Erasmus' commentaire au livre du ciel et du monde. He invents the coordinate systems that will later be named Cartesian, and he provides the precision of the law of falling bodies later verified by Galileo. Stuff here, right?
Yeah, that's good. Thanks. So I kind of anticipated a little bit on this section, but yeah, so here we see the beginnings of this transformation from the medieval Aristotelian conception of motion to the modern conception of motion. So this notion of impetus is sort of the key in this transition, where impetus means it's something that's transmitted to the moved object from its the cause of motion from the mover. And then an object preserves that impetus until something else acts against it to stop it or to change its direction of motion. So an arrow in flight will it receives an impetus from the string of the bow, and then it will continue in flight as long as it can until the resistance of the air and the action of gravity cause it to fall to the ground or until it hits a target. And so here we have a completely different conception of physics because it sort of eliminates the whole doctrine of the natural places of entities. So in Aristotle, the motion of entities is either violent or natural. So a stone falling to the ground is a natural motion because the natural place of the stone is on the ground or towards the center of the world. Whereas lifting a stone up from the ground or throwing a stone into the air is a violent motion. It's taking a stone from its natural place and moving it away from its natural place. And so this whole doctrine disappears with the notion of impetus because we no longer need to account for the motion of entities by the way that they are related to their place in the universe. We instead have this account of motion brought about by impetus, and in particular in relation to celestial mechanics. So these authors who introduce this notion of impetus, they hold. So this is one point where they are different from modern accounts of motion, like from Galileo onwards. So they hold that circular motion is also brought about by an impetus. So an entity can be set in circular motion in orbits around the Earth or around the Sun, and will continue in circular motion indefinitely. and so there's no need for something like a soul of the world or some sort of intelligence to keep the planets in motion and keep them orbiting in their orbits. It's just the impetus that set them in motion, at the beginning of time or beginning of the solar system or whatever, and that impetus continues indefinitely, and so it's a sort of desacralization, I guess we can say, of the universe. So the universe is no longer understood in terms of the order of where entities belong or where they're supposed to be, and in accordance with an intelligence. Instead, we have a sort of impetus that brings about the emotions that we observe in the world. Yeah, and so we see that this primacy of circular motion. So for Aristotle, circular motion is the most perfect kind of motion because it returns to itself. It's not it sort of it returns to itself. It sort of brings about its own continuation, as opposed to local motion in a straight line, which it depends on some sort of mover to bring it about. And there's the famous doctrine of the unmoved mover, who brings about the movement of the celestial spheres. And the unmoved mover is a thought thinking itself. And so there's a certain circularity or circular nature of this thought that thinks itself, and it sort of makes sense, or there's an analogy with the circular movement of the heavens and the circular motion of thought. But these are some of the most obscure passages in Aristotle, so it's not. It's definitely a problem to understand exactly what that doctrine of the unmoved mover consists in. And we see here that this notion of the circular movement as primary, or as having an important ontological status, is preserved, even though we have a significant transformation of Aristotelian physics with this notion of impetus. They still preserve the notion of circular motion as being something that has a sort of ontological primacy, that it's not, whereas in contemporary physics or in modern physics, circular motion is always the product of multiple forces. It's the results of different forces that lead to circular motion, as opposed to something simple and immediate, like it is in this physics.
I thought
So
this
just
point
as
about.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Wengus.
I thought this point about how the reflective individual is no longer the center of the world, privileged in his dignity, due to the decentering that is caused by this kind of new, I guess, conception of the natural world in natural philosophy. I thought this was interesting. Obviously, like, the decentering is in part the need for geocentrism, with a philosophy of natural place. But I think there's also maybe, I don't know, a kind of understanding that there's something that's kind of immediately intuitive about the Aristotelian conception of motion as, I mean, just the way that the world is kind of becomes intelligible in the first place. Like, it makes sense to say that fire rises because it wants to rise, and stones fall because they want to fall. And so it's not just the, like, literal decentering of the universe by considering the Earth not to be the center of the universe, but also a kind of decentering of maybe, like, the immediate intelligibility of the world, and as we've talked about before, kind of the numerical identity of the way that things appear to us and the way that they actually are. And a new conception of nature as not as it immediately appears, I guess, and more mathematical, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's right. Aristotle's physics is a physics of common sense, in the sense that when we observe motion in everyday life, in the terrestrial realm, motion only continues as long as there's something that sort of makes it continue, right? Like, if you like you take a marble or whatever, you push it, it rolls for a little while, and then it stops. It doesn't continue indefinitely. So this idea of indefinite motion through impetus is completely contrary to the observed reality of motion, which follows the Aristotelian sort of principles of physics. So for Aristotle, you can just sort of observe the way entities move and abstract from the individual processes of motion that you see to come up with these sort of general principles. And there's a sort of continuity between observation and the intellectual principles that you come up with. Whereas with starting with this impetus conception, and even more so with Galileo and later, there's a conception of the universe as potentially quite different than the common sense understanding that we have of it. And so there's what we see later in modern philosophy with Galileo and Descartes is this conception of the world as divided up into primary and secondary qualities. So entities have primary qualities in themselves. They have extension, like a certain size and shape and so on, independently of whatever we might think about them or observe. But they only have secondary qualities like color, taste, temperature, and so on, insofar as there's an observer who is affected in a certain way by that body. And so the world is sort of split up into two different realms that are very distinct from each other, because entities in themselves don't have any color, don't have any taste or temperature or whatever. It's only because they affect the human body in various ways that they have something like a temperature or a color. And so this notion of impetus is sort of the beginning of that. It sort of drives a wedge between the experience of the world that we have as just agents that operate with sort of a common sense understanding of the physics of medium-sized objects in a fluid like air, and then the sort of underlying physics of the true nature of reality, which can be quite different from that apparent physics of medium-sized objects in a fluid.
I just was about to say about the process of rebellious thinking, like against like the mainstream idea of that time. Cause like I just like thought of Foucault's like the order of what is it? What is the book? The order of subject of the objects. The order of things, right? The order of things, right?
Right, the Foucault book.
Yeah. So
yes, order of things. Yeah.
Yeah, just like it's not really clear, but how people try to like find some kind of new rules from the existing kind of ideas. The point here, like how like Buridan like came up with the idea from the analogy, like how he like could like the compare. I mean, similarity between the heaven, the movement of heaven, and the projectile. They could be same, and then how it can be like accepted. Of course, it have been taken a lot of time by. I mean, in order to be taken by people, but the very first point, some people like Buridan or other at the end, like the person who wrote the book, it's a marvelous like. These people like, I mean, kind of like created some different idea from the mainstream idea then, and then kind of my question about the individuals, like here explanation of the paradoxical aspect of the notion of individual, kind of it at this time the individual was central figure of the whole kind of idea of the universe. Kind of was it God, like the which is put on the center position of the whole universe. The universe is has become the center. Taken center point of the universe in later time, isn't it? Like how it's possible, like the paradoxical aspect of notion. What it explains here is it seems it used to be geocentric, taken geocentric, anthropocentric dignity, but after having kind of a new mode of ideas, and then the individual that idea is loses its a kind of position. That's what I read, but I can't totally understand this part because for me, like God or heaven, the God is it seems like the central position of that time. As far as I understand, is that wrong?
Right. Yeah. So there's a few things in that in those questions or those comments. Yeah. So I think you're right to say that this is a really sort of amazing idea to look at projectiles and to look at the motion of the heavens and say these are actually the same kind of thing. To say that both of them are brought about by something like impetus. Because this problem of the motion of projectiles was sort of an open one throughout medieval physics and medieval philosophy, and yeah, like there were attempts. I forget who it was exactly. Certain Arab philosophers who are sort of skipped over in this account of the history of philosophy, but they had versions where the motion of an arrow was brought about by the air sort of pushing the arrow along, so that the air would sort of divide in front of the arrow and then recirculate around the arrow and push it forward. And so there was always something in motion bringing about the motion of the arrow. And so this was sort of one solution that was proposed to this problem, but it was a kind of open problem throughout the medieval period. And so we can see that this notion of impetus it has a sort of internal development within the Aristotelian tradition. So there's a problem that is already recognized by Aristotelian philosophers that leads to this notion of impetus. But there's also sort of external factors that lead to it eventually becoming dominant in modern physics. So the whole sort of Copernican revolution had to do or came about in part because of problems with calculating the date of Easter, actually, if I remember correctly. Like Easter has to happen on, I think it's the first Sunday after the vernal equinox or something like that. And so you have to be able to calculate the vernal equinox. And then there were problems in the medieval period where the date of Easter was being miscalculated and so would appear too early or too late or whatever. And this was in part because it was so difficult to work with the Ptolemaic system, because you had the circles of the planets around the sun, and then you had these epicycles where each planet would, the planets around the Earth, and then within the orbit of the planet, the planet would have its own sort of secondary circles so the planet would like move in these complicated circles within circles. So calculating, when exactly certain celestial phenomena would happen was quite difficult. And so the Copernican system is introduced basically just as a simplification of the system to predict the motions of the planets. But the consequence of this Copernican system is that you have to give an alternate account. You have to sort of completely reconstruct physics, because if you say that the Earth is actually moving, then you have to give some account of why is it that we don't actually see that motion, or we don't feel like we're moving. The Earth feels like it's stable and stationary. And why is it that when you throw an object, it doesn't fly off as the Earth moves away from it, and so on? You have to give a completely different account of motion to account for the observed phenomena that sort of make the Earth seem like it's stationary. And so this impetus theory sort of converges with the Copernican theory with Galileo, who sort of completes this transformation of physics. And of course, he was quite controversial in his time, and ends up being condemned by the Inquisition and so on. So it's a long process before this new physics becomes sort of recognized as being the correct one.
Has a kind of like some kind of changes, like tremendous changes in that concept. Here, individual is like a human individual, right? Like not God, like individual as a human being is like getting independent from the influence of God, something like that.
Yeah, there's I think it's a very complicated transition in the notion of the individual, because as we've been seeing the past few weeks, there wasn't like a single universal doctrine of what the individual was throughout the medieval period. We had different sort of competing accounts of the individual. So we have the Thomistic theory, where the individual is individuation is brought about by material accidents that individuate a form. And then we have the Scoticist theory, where there's this sort of immediate individuation of entities, this quiddity. And so there are these multiple different theories that are trying to account for what it is that makes an individual into this individual. But what happens with the transition to the early modern period, as we'll see, I think we should get to it today, is that this whole set of problems, or this whole set of competing theories is transformed. So instead, we have this notion of Simondon will analyze it in terms of construction. So the problem now is how to construct, like starting from the individual human subject, how do we construct entities, like how do we construct our knowledge of empirically given entities, or our knowledge of God? How do we sort of get outside the individual? So it's no longer a question of what is it that makes an individual into an individual. It's a question of starting from the human individual subject, how do we get outside of that subject? So yeah, it's a transformation not just of particular ideas of what the individual is, but of the whole sort of set of problems, or the set of questions about that are being asked about the individual.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so let's go on to actually one last bit before we move forward is this. There's this one little sentence about Nicolas Oresme, or Orem. He's a very interesting figure in the history of thought that I don't know a lot about, but there's a mention here that he comes up with the idea of coordinates, which are, of course, hugely important in the analysis of motion, the sort of modern conception of motion. There's this, so the idea of coordinates, of course, like you probably remember this from like high school algebra, but you assign an x value and a y value, and you to whatever property you're trying to measure, and then you have a graph where the x values are along one axis and the y values are on the other axis, and then you plot the points where of those x and y values. And this allows you to, for example, to take the motion of a projectile and draw its trajectory as a curve on the page. So something that previously was only experienceable through time, where you could see the projectile, the arrow or whatever, flying through the air. Now you can plot it onto a page and see the whole trajectory in one glance, in one instant. So it's transforming time into space, essentially. And this allows you to sort of manipulate that trajectory and ask questions. How high, what's the maximum point that this trajectory reaches? How long does it take to go from one point to another? And what's the angle of the trajectory, and so on. So it allows for all sorts of manipulation. It seems very simple, like we teach it to kids in high school or even earlier nowadays, but it takes like this complete. You have to have a completely different sort of grasp of what motion is before you can even start to come up with this idea of graphing a motion in relation to coordinates like this.
I know that the focus in this section was on the movement from an Aristotelian notion of motion to the modern one, but also this idea of a kind of Cartesian space is a huge departure, obviously, from the Aristotelian notion of place, which is like it's hard for me to wrap my head around, but it's like the inner limit of the outer, like basically the cosmos with respect to a thing. So they're like, I don't think that Aristotelian physics would admit of the possibility of something like Cartesian coordinates.
Yeah, right. So in Aristotelian physics, the central notion is place, and so the place of an entity is, like, as you said, is the limit that surrounds the entity. So, like, if you have a square or a cube, say, the place of the cube is like the rest of the universe with like a space for that cube surrounding that cube, and then you can sort of and then these places for entities, there are sort of natural places, of course, where the entities are where they belong, or where they sort of tend towards. So stones are on the ground, fire is up in the air or up in the sky, etc. And then there are unnatural places after entities have been moved by an agent of some kind. Um, uh, and there's no real notion of space as such as this, and in particular, there's no notion of the void. Aristotle is explicitly against the notion that there is an empty space or a void. So everything, the whole universe is full of something. Everything is in a place, and that place is an entity, is not nothing. So it's a completely different conception of the order of the world. So there's no such thing as empty space in which entities are. There's a whole sort of network of places that are filled with entities of various kinds. And so this has to be completely transformed just to have this notion of a graph with Cartesian coordinates. Like you have to sort of grasp space as being this framework in which entities are located in relation to these coordinates, these mathematical entities, as opposed to being in places that are concrete entities in which other entities are found. So yes, it's definitely a huge transformation of the concept of like, you can't even say a transformation of the concept of space, because Aristotle doesn't really have a concept of space, but it's a translation from the concept of place to a concept of space that is sort of goes along with the transformation of the notion of motion, and those two transformations are sort of coordinate transformations. They happen together and they sort of reinforce each other.
I can read Descartes. Should I just read this whole thing? I know it's kind of long, but it seemed to me like it kind of reads itself a lot. But
yeah, let's do one page or so, just because it is a bit long. So yeah, like, we'll do a page and then stop, and then we'll do the rest.
Okay. Meister Eckhart. With Eckhart, the mystical movement of the 14th century seemingly leads to a very different vision of individual reality. Nevertheless, the same paradox remains there as well. In a certain sense, finite and individual creatures endowed with a veritable reality cannot exist outside God in the same sense as divine reality. Quote, individuality is a pure accident, a nothingness. Suppress this nothingness, all creatures are one. Unquote. Individual destiny can thus be consummated only in unification with God, which, for the individual, is a complete and radical decentering. And yet this decentering is merely the suppression of a nothingness. It does not remove anything from the individual already considered from the point of view of what it will become. This decentering only seems to remove something from the individual if it is considered as initially given in its entirety, i.e., when it exists as a separate being and is determined as the member of a species. As the member of a species, the individual is separate from other individuals, because individuality qua separation is all that remains to the individual when the species has already been loaded with. The problem of individuality is anterior to that of individuation, since it consists in asking which part of reality belongs to the species and which part to the individual. It is only when this problem is answered that one can ask how the reality of the species, if the species is the bearer of a significant part of reality, fragments into individuals due to a principle of individuation. But at the level of the first problem, the metaphysical dilemma, individual or species, may be refused. One can imagine a primordial existence of the individual outside any species. The individual is then no longer merely individuated species, but directly and primarily being. In this sense, the particular being that is the individual is not fundamentally distinguished from the unique and universal being that is divinity. The former is only distinguished from the latter in an inessential and ancillary manner. Consequently, the individual may discover its veritable reality by stripping away its particularity and that which constituted its division from other particular beings. And this discovery is not an impoverishment, but a deepening of the discovery of a definitive and fully real state. The primordial reality of the individual was not to be distinguished and separate, but to be. The individual is something of being, and it wants to become the being. To abandon limitation and particularity is not to abandon reality, but to eliminate the primordial illusion. In that case, this individual, which possesses within it something of being from the moment of the first act of reflection, must not seek the mediation of the species or group to discover within it the absolute reality that will annihilate this nothingness that its particularity is. Does this particularity itself possess a reality? This is difficult to answer. It can only be acknowledged that this initial isolation of the individual is within it, like the negative sign of the fact that its reality is not to belong to a species or group. The individual's particularity protects it from the illusion of the individuated species. It is easier to go from the particular being than the individual is to the absolute being than from the individual's relative situation in the specific group to the real position facing the absolute. I guess one thing I find interesting about this philosophy is that this idea that individuality is nothing, but there is a kind of positivity to this nothing in the sense that it allows the individual to go from its particularity to kind of unity with the divine.
Yeah, this section is a little bit more obscure than some of the previous ones, just in part because the author that we're discussing here was a mystic and not a philosopher. So he's necessarily not going to be as straightforward to interpret as a philosophical doctrine. But yeah, so there's this notion that the individual is a kind of nothingness, or the individuality of the individual is a kind of nothingness. And what is real in the individual is precisely God. So union with God is a kind of disappearance of the individuality of the individual. But this disappearance is not a loss of something. So it's not the case that the individual has to sort of sacrifice its reality to unite with God. It's actually by sort of eliminating this illusion of separation from God, the individual actually achieves a greater reality, or reaches this greater reality that it is God, precisely by eliminating this illusion of separation from God. And then, yeah, so Simondon himself sort of recognizes that this doctrine is kind of difficult to interpret when he asked, does this particularity itself possess a reality? And his answer, or what he says here, is that this is difficult to answer. So he's sort of acknowledging that that Eckhart is difficult to interpret in philosophical terms because he's not a philosopher. He's not setting out a systematic doctrine of the individual, but he's instead a mystic who's trying to sort of capture this experience of union with God. And I think, and then we'll see more on this as we continue with this section, but I think Simondon wants to treat Eckhart as sort of continuing the same sort of theory of the individual as we found with Buridan and what was the other guy's name? It was Buridan. Anyway, this doctrine of the sort of decentering of the individual is this sort of decentering, the anti-anthropomorphism or anti-anthropocentrism is sort of continued here Eckhart, in the sense that Eckhart treats the human individual as a kind of nothingness, and wants to eliminate the illusion of the separation of the individual from reality, in the same way that in the physics of impetus, we sort of treat the realm of motion that we're familiar with as a kind of illusory reality, which is separate from the potentially very different reality of the entities in motion through impetus. So it's definitely a surprising comparison, that the sort of origins of modern physics and this 14th century mysticism have a sort of convergence in decentering the individual and sort of treating the individual as something illusory. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read, let's see. Yeah, this is quite long. I'll read another page and then we'll stop there. Passage is possible from the particular absolute to the absolute of divine reality, whereas the relativity of communal existence and collective operations, giving themselves as an absolute, forever encloses the particular being that the individual is within their relativity. The individual is closer to the absolute in the solitude of its particularity than in the relativity of earthly existence. The negative characteristic of the individual's isolation is therefore that due to which there is something absolute about the individual. At the level of individual reality, this isolation is a condition of the absolute. The limited being can be absolute only in isolation. The nothingness of individual isolation is not at all something of the being, but it preserves the being enclosed in this particularity that the individual is from the relativity of a communal existence taken as a final goal. That is how this paradox of individuality can be partially elucidated. Pure nothingness can have value as a condition of access to the absolute. What the individual abandons when he approaches the divine state is the nothingness that envelops individual particularity. This is the explanation for the functional importance of this nothingness and all the negotiations associated with individual particularity. Individualities are not endowed with a veritable reality insofar as they are separate, but they contain an eminent reality as the starting point for a movement toward being, which is spiritual advancement. The reality of the individual is a reality in the individual according to the stages of a dynamism that begins with the individual. It is starting from the individual that the soul can become separate and be informed in God, become convinced by the nobility and purity of divine nature. This fundamental attitude constitutes an ethics that becomes an integral part of the movement toward God. The more important rules define a state of the individual with respect to the world and itself, not an action vis-a-vis the community. Poverty is the state of someone who knows nothing, who wants nothing, and who has nothing. Those who are truly poor are those who are completely separated from themselves and from other creatures. The poor are in a state in which individuality and non-individuality confront one another and coincide. They no longer even have the will to accomplish the will of God. They are in a state of complete passivity wherein they leave God to accomplish his work in them, as ready to suffer the torments of hell as to participate in the joys of beatitude. Virtues are not acquisitions of the soul, but the very being of the soul. Works qua works are nothing. Only the will from which they proceed has a value. The true work, the internal work that alone brings one closer to God, is the will unconcerned with any external success, a will that is consequently superior to any circumstance, to space and time, a will that can never be forestalled. Love is not the son of Poros and Penia, but of plenitude identical to God himself. The soul ensconced in this way back into its own depths, i.e. on the hither side of the states in which it has a limited and determined activity, finds complete freedom, does not need repeated and multiple contacts with the exterior milieu and the social milieu. The inferior activities of the soul are those that end in action. These are the will, reason, the understanding, the external senses. These activities are ordered and guided by the withdrawal of the soul into itself. So there's this sort of paradox that Simondon points to here, is that the individual as such, or the individuality of the individual is nothingness, is just an illusion, but it's precisely through isolation of the individual and separation from communal existence that that the individual can sort of realize that nothingness, or realize that the separation is an illusion. And so I think we can compare this isolation to what Simondon says in Volume 1 about this ordeal of solitude that is needed to sort of grasp the trans-individual, to have access to the trans-individual. So there's, in the same way, we have this sort of ordeal of solitude that the individual has to go through here to sort of let go of its individuality. So it's only in separation from communal existence that we can actually give up our individual reality and find this union with God. Okay, so let's go on to the rest. Let's read the rest of the Eckhart section. If someone else would like to read.
Oh, I can do it. Before reading, maybe a simple question about like it's kind of unclear still, like the relation between nothingness and the particularity. It's kind of in some parts like understandable, but at the same time, how nothingness can be, I mean, related to the particularity, right?
Yeah, it's a difficult doctrine to sort of make sense of, and this is sort of what Simondon calls the paradox here, is that it's precisely by isolating itself or isolating oneself that the individual comes to fully accept that nothingness that it is. So this particularity of the individual is something that is ultimately a nothingness, but in order to fully grasp that nothingness or to fully accept that nothingness, we have to sort of pass through the particularity of the individual. We have to isolate ourselves from the communal world, and sort of only in that way can we fully accept the nothingness of the individual. So yeah, you're right. It's definitely difficult to understand, but yeah, it's this sort of conversion between the individual and union with God, or the nothingness of the individual, that we have to sort of hold on to here.
I try to maybe like we can find some kind of clue later on, but like in terms of time and space, like when we live our life, we have a particularity, but in throughout the human history, like we can be defined as like a nothing, like because like I mean, unless we become like a great figure in the history book, but we are going to be no one. So in that sense, it's a kind of like regarded as nothingness, and then, but in particular time and space, we can be marked as our own particularity to someone, to somebody. Maybe like Simondon developed that idea at the end of the day, like collective individuation. I just guess, but random guess, but maybe we can find some more ideas about this later on.
Yeah, I think this notion of nothingness and particularity, I think it's a bit different than the sort of historical relation. So yes, you're right that in the long run of history, each of us ends up being a sort of nothingness, that 10,000 years from now, no one will know who any of us are. But I think the nothingness of the individual here is a nothingness in relation to God. So the being of each individual is really just the being of God. It's only at a level of sort of illusory appearance that each of us sees ourselves or considers ourselves to be distinct from God, to be an entity that is distinct from God. And so once we fully grasp or fully accept that we are that our reality, the reality that we contain, is actually just God, that there's nothing in us except for God, then that illusion disappears. We sort of we achieve this union with God, not as if we were sort of one entity that unites with another entity, but by sort of overcoming the illusion that we were separated at all in the first place. And so that's the sense of the nothingness of the individual, that it's this illusory nature of the individual.
Oh, okay. In this time, it's a kind of impossible to separate from God. Got it.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That we sort of treat ourselves as separate from God, but this is an illusion, and we have to overcome that illusion.
All right. Thank you. So let me read it. Such is the vision according to which the totality of the diverse, the sum of all separate individualities, appears as a manifestation or a revelation of a deeper unity. Appearing as expression, the diverse is immediately negated as diverse. The individual is known as reality only in its isolation from other individuals, which returns it to God and prevents it from being taken as an ultimate reality. The word does not find its meaning solely through its link with the other words of the phrase. For if a word has no meaning by itself, several words, even more so, do not have meaning because they are several. Each of the words must have a meaning relative to the thought it expresses for all the words to have a meaning. Context is the meaning and not in the other words. The context is in the thought and not in the addition of words. This method is applied to theology. It indicates that divinity of the Trinity is not nature, the nature, while below this unparticipated unity that remains in itself. The three persons constitute the nature, the creation of the world, and all the procession of the created things outside of God is still an expression of God. Under these conditions, this creation is not strictly different in kind from the generation of the Son by the Father. The Son indeed expresses the thought of the Father, which himself the absolute unity in which known and knower are identical. The Spirit unites the Father and the Son. Each thing has its eternal being in God, including the world, a word. Creation is in this a temporal act through which God has expressed himself in his Son. Each individual existence of each creature in a determined time and space cannot be conceived as a result of positive act of God. To find the existence of things outside God, the diversity that separates them can only be conceived as a nothingness and a deficiency. Just like in the theory of Plotinus and Saint Augustine, error is a simple deficiency and a defect linked to this diversity. The function of the individual soul is the knowledge of the primordial unity of creatures, the depth of the soul. The funke is synthesis, place wherein every creature discovers its unity. Knowledge has the value of being. It is a transmutation of things themselves in their return to God. Christ then becomes a model more than a redeemer of Adam's sin. He is a model of the perfect union of God and creature. Even without Adam's sin, this incarnation would have taken place. Christ is the guide of souls, whereby the universe returns to God. The aspect of Christian doctrine that subordinates individual life to a historical tradition, to juridical and sacramental institutions becomes essential. This doctrine was disseminated by Jonas Toller, Henry Suso, and John van Ruybroek, for whom the quality of God surpasses all creatures. Despite the extreme differences between the academic doctrine of the alchemists and the mystical doctrine of the Eckhart, the conception of the individual implies the common postulate. It is not necessary to pass through the species to know the individual. This individual is the solid basis for acting and for knowing outside any natural or institutional group. Reality is to be sought in individual entirety, not in tradition or group institutions. Whatever the ultimate reality or necessary starting point, the individual must be grasped in its isolation. By being particular, it holds something absolute. There is no natural place for alchemists, just as there is no validity of the tradition and the sacraments for Eckhart. The planet is moved by its impetus, just as the soul is carried toward God by itself. Oh, haha, clearer, yeah.
Yeah, this part helps make sense of what we were reading earlier. But yes, it's this sort of surprising convergence of the mystical doctrine of Eckhart with the physical doctrine of impetus that we saw earlier, and with the conceptualism of Occam. So there's this sort of turn towards it's sort of paradoxical, as Simondon recognizes, but by treating the individual as a nothingness or as an illusion, in Eckhart we sort of end up privileging the individual sort of experience, the individual mystical experience, this inner experience of union with God, as opposed to the external reality of the church and the sacraments and so on. So all of that is sort of treated as unnecessary and kind of a distraction, really. And it's ultimately this individual union with God that is important. And yeah, so this is part. We can see this transition or this introduction of this mystical notion in the 14th century as a sort of prefiguring of the Cartesian turn towards the individual. So we have all these different strands that are sort of converging towards Descartes in the 14th century, leading up to the 15th century, and then eventually to Descartes in the 17th century. So we have the transformation in the notion of space and place. We have the transformation of the notion of motion. We have this turn towards the inner experience of the individual. And we have this sort of epistemological turn that we saw a little bit earlier today. And so all of these things are sort of leading up to or are part of what contributes to the beginning of modern philosophy in the 16th century or 17th century.
See, this seems a lot like the doctrine of conversion that we saw in earlier medieval thought, but as you just noted, it seems like the difference here is the emphasis on the inner life, maybe.
Yeah, I think it's this this sort of turn to the individual as like yeah. So in this notion of conversion that we saw earlier, we had this idea that the individual can have sort of an immediate access to God outside of the institutions of the church, the sort of communal life of the faithful. But what we have here is this, I guess, the sort of illusory nature of the apparent world is what's new with Eckhart, in the sense that we have this sort of realm of appearances that sort of takes shape or becomes separated for the first time. This realm of appearances that we can sort of that we pass through in searching for unity with God. So the whole world of communal life and of the insertion of the individual into that communal life is a kind of illusion, a kind of appearance that we have to get behind or get beyond to actually have union with God. I think that's what Simondon finds new in Eckhart in connection or in contrast to the earlier doctrines of conversion. Okay, I think that's probably a good place for us to stop here because the next bit is a couple of pages. So we can pick up next time on the section from the Renaissance to the 17th century. He sort of skips over the Renaissance, really. He doesn't mention much, but there are important figures that he skips over, like Giordano Bruno and Galileo, who sort of continue the transformation that we saw beginning here, but he sort of skips straight from the late medieval period to the early modern period and doesn't really talk about the Renaissance for whatever reason. Okay, so yeah, thanks for coming out. Thanks for your contributions today, and hope to see you next week.